In this video, what we're going to do is move away from looking at voluntary manslaughter, i.e. the cases where we can satisfy a partial defence, either through diminished responsibility or even through loss of control, and then now going to start to talk about some of the more involuntary forms of manslaughter. We're going to begin in this video by talking about unlawful act manslaughter. We'll talk about how we construct unlawful act manslaughter, sometimes known as constructive manslaughter, and then we will talk about some of the cases that illustrate these points in more detail. So, like I said, we're going to examine the key components of unlawful act manslaughter. We'll talk about the major components of unlawful act manslaughter, and we'll talk about how these are fit together and how this is operationalized in the English law itself. So, some textbooks will refer to unlawful act manslaughter as constructive manslaughter. For those of you who have studied law at A level and are coming up to university to study law, you will probably be more familiar with the phrase unlawful act manslaughter. However, there are textbooks that will use the phrase constructive manslaughter. So I believe Smith and Hogan use the phrase constructive manslaughter, whereas other textbooks may use unlawful act. They refer to the same thing. Now, in reality, you can essentially justify calling it unlawful act or constructive on the basis of any kind of rationale, essentially, because it is called constructive manslaughter because you construct the manslaughter charge on the basis of a prior criminal act. It is unlawful act manslaughter because it requires an unlawful act for which a homicide can then be constructed on top of. So either way, you can understand why it's called either unlawful act or constructive. The leading case in this area of the law is the case of the Director of Public Prosecutions versus Newbury and Jones. Now, this is a case from 1977, and you can see what we can really get to be the key components and the key elements of constructive manslaughter in this particular case itself. So the facts itself are quite interesting. You have multiple defendants, so there are two defendants. Both are aged 15. And they had been playing around with a paving stone which was left on a bridge by some previous workmen. So they were messing around with the paving stone, and in the process of doing so, they pushed the stone off the bridge. Now, unbeknownst to them, it fell onto another individual, someone who was walking down below, and killed them. It was quite a heavy paving stone, falling at relatively, probably terminal velocity. The blunt force trauma would have killed this victim. Now, they were both convicted of constructive manslaughter, of unlawful act manslaughter, but what they did was they appealed on the basis that they did not foresee the danger, and so as a result of which, because they didn't foresee that when they pushed the rock off the bridge, that there was going to be someone down below who was going to get hit by the rock and killed, because they did not foresee that danger, they ought not to be convicted of constructive manslaughter. Now, this argument was then had and went all the way to the House of Lords, where this appeal would be rejected. And the reason why they rejected the appeal in the House of Lords was because this idea of foreseeability, i.e. relevant foresight, isn't a requirement for showing unlawful act manslaughter. So essentially, they argued on appeal, we ought not be convicted because we did not foresee the danger. Well, the House of Lords said, well, it doesn't matter if you foresaw the danger or not. It is not relevant to your conviction whether or not you foresaw the danger. And as a result of which, your appeal was rejected and the conviction was upheld. In reality, all that is necessary for there to be an unlawful act is that there must be that the act itself must be dangerous and that the act itself must cause the death of the victim. So let's think about unlawful act manslaughter in a bit more detail and think about the kinds of components. The first thing is, given the name and given the fact that you construct the manslaughter charge on the basis of a prior unlawful act, there therefore has to be an unlawful act. So it is a construction offence. You construct it on the basis of a prior act, and therefore come to the conclusion of a homicide charge as a result of which. It is therefore necessary that there must be a prior charge to constitute an unlawful act, one which is a criminal offence in and of itself. And this is illustrated by the case of Lamb from 1967, because what this case was a case involving a defendant who had pointed a gun at his friend, and then he tried to pretend to shoot the gun. I say tried to pretend to shoot the gun because even though it was meant as a joke, he in reality did point the gun and did shoot the gun, and the gun did fire and killed his friend, who then is now the victim of the homicide. The gun in question was a revolver, and he had mistakenly believed that the bullet was not in the chamber that he was firing from. So, for those of you who don't know, a revolver is a type of handheld gun, where you have essentially a spiral whereby there are bullets in each of the different chambers, and as you fire the gun, it switches to the next chamber. And so this is where you get a lot of various different games, like Russian roulette, for example. If there is no bullet in the chamber that is cocked to the point at which you're going to fire from that chamber, then there can be no bullet to fire from. So if you have no, which is why when you play Russian roulette, if you play Russian roulette, you put one bullet in one of the chambers, you spin it round at random, and then you essentially play a test of faith as to whether or not you are going to shoot yourself in the head. So he did not believe that there was a bullet in the chamber that he was firing from. Now, the constructive offence, which was built here, was the crime of assault. Now, we're going to get to assault in a future lesson's time, but assault essentially involves the apprehension of harm that is done to a victim. And so as a result of which, you can then take the crime of assault, which is the constructive offence, and then you can therefore construct further the unlawful act manslaughter on top of the crime of assault to get the offence of unlawful act manslaughter. Now, the reason why this was ultimately quashed was because the crime of assault requires a certain mens rea. Okay, it is not just the actus reus, which is the apprehension of harm, but there is a mens rea element as well. There is an intentionality that is required for the crime of assault. And so, because there wasn't this prerequisite mens rea for the crime of assault, it could not be shown that this constructed offence existed, this unlawful act in which we are constructing the manslaughter existed. So if there was no unlawful act, then therefore the conviction of manslaughter must be quashed, because of the fact that you can't construct manslaughter on the basis of it on an unlawful act if that unlawful act can't be shown to have taken place either. Okay, so that's why we see in this case that the unlawful act is very important to be shown and to be proven quite substantially before you then go on to looking at other charges, i.e. on the basis of manslaughter. In the case of Crown versus Church from 1966, we see a fight that takes place between the defendant and a victim. During this fight, the victim would get knocked unconscious. The defendant, D, believed that they were killed in the process of the fight and not merely knocked unconscious. So they had a fight, the victim was punched or fell to the floor and banged their heads, and they were knocked unconscious. The defendant thinks, oh my god, I've just killed this individual. And so, as a result of which, the defendant, believing he had just killed the individual, decided to dump the body of the victim in the river, the still alive body in the river, believing her to be dead. Now, the act of doing so would ultimately lead her to die as a result of drowning. Now, the argument that was presented here, the sort of the legal question that was had, was the idea that was presented by the defendant, among other things, that was that essentially because he believed she was already dead, the act of throwing her into the river could not have been seen as a dangerous act, since there was nothing dangerous about throwing a dead body into a river. Remember, the unlawful act itself has to be a dangerous act, because ultimately the construction of manslaughter through the unlawful act implies that the unlawful act itself can give rise to the death of an individual. Okay, so things like assault, things like battery, things like grievous bodily harm, in some cases even things like theft that goes awry and causes offences. And causes damage to another individual physically. You can't, for example, have an offence such as I'm trying to think of one, such as maybe fraud, for example, as considered to be a dangerous act, and then therefore that leads to a constructive offence of manslaughter. So the act itself that is unlawful, it should be dangerous, because the act itself has to cause the death of another individual. Now, the defendant, like I said here, presented the view that because he believed she was already dead, the cause of death was not the victim being knocked unconscious. The cause of death was the defendant throwing the victim into a river. And so we have to analyze the question of whether or not the throwing the body into the river was considered to be an unlawful act or a dangerous act. And he argued that, or at least the defense argued that, it can't have been a dangerous act because there's nothing dangerous about throwing a dead body into a river. Even though she wasn't dead at the time, the defendant believed that she was. Now, the court said the following in making a decision. They said that the unlawful act must be such as all sober and reasonable people would inevitably recognise must subject the other person to at least the risk of harm resulting therefrom, albeit not serious harm. Okay, so there is a requirement here that harm is created to essentially levy this as a dangerous act, albeit not necessarily serious harm. Okay. The final thing, therefore, is that you have to have we have to have an unlawful act. You have to have that act be committed. So things like assault, if there's no mens rea for assault, then it can't be considered to be a constructive manslaughter. The act itself must be dangerous, and then the dangerous unlawful act must be the cause of death. This is the final requirement. Provided that you can show that the defendant has committed an act which is both unlawful and dangerous, then that act must be the cause of the victim's death in order for constructive manslaughter to be operationalized. Now, the key issue here relates not to the fact that the defendant causes the victim's death, but that it was the very specific acts which were unlawful and dangerous, which were committed by the defendant, which causes the death of the victim.